Let's talk about the First Amendment. The First Amendment is about as interesting as it gets in my mind. And usually a lot of you guys are really fascinated with the First Amendment too. There's five main parts we're going to talk about. We're going to break that down and we're going to look at this. So first of all, let's start with the pieces of the First Amendment. So the first thing that the Founding Fathers established as an amendment to the Constitution was this idea that the separation of church and state above all. So they established a clause, or it's a free exercise clause. We'll call it separation. People call it, we'll talk about separation of church and state. Separation of church as being religion, state as being the government. It's called the Establishment Clause almost all the time. You cannot establish an official religion in the United States. Or the Free Exercise Clause, which means you can freely exercise whatever religion you believe in. Government cannot establish religious support or one religion over another. There is no official religion of America. A lot of countries have official religions. So, for example, obviously the Vatican, Roman Catholic, is the official religion. Indonesia is the largest Muslim nation. The official religion of Indonesia is Islam, and so forth and so on. But in America, we do not have an established religion. This is key to the Founding Fathers' idea and their dogma. We've talked about, it's been a while, in the Enlightenment philosophy, that Voltaire was very influential on the Founding Fathers, and a lot of Enlightenment philosophers were concerned with this idea that religion and government need to stay separated from each other. And the writers and the actual Founding Fathers that wrote the Constitution tended to be deists. James Madison was a deist. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. They believed in God, but they were very apprehensive about organized religion. They said organized religions were created by humans, therefore they could be fallible, and they were based in making mistakes, and they were misinterpretations or so forth or so on of what God or gods to believe in. So let's leave those two things separate from each other. And they make it pretty clear in the First Amendment, even though most of the Founding Fathers were in fact Christian, they signed off on this idea to protect any religion. And now we extend it to all religions. And at the time, I don't know if they could have imagined how diverse America ever would have been. The famous case we're going to talk about that really even shows you how important this is in America is Engel versus Vitale. Engel versus Vitale happens in 1962, so not too long ago. And the challenge was school sponsorship of religious activities violates the Establishment Clause. So it really started with the simple idea that voluntary prayer. So many schools, and there's many schools today, trust me, in parts of America, especially in rural areas or in the deep South, where the principal would get on the PA or would lead a prayer, or teachers would lead prayers, or so forth or so on, before football, basketball games and all that. And the argument was, well, look, we're not making anybody pray. And it was, they're almost exclusively Judeo-Christian prayers. And the Supreme Court looked at this, they said, yeah, that may be true, but you kind of are. You're putting pressure and you're isolating and you're alienating people to do something in a public environment. And under the First Amendment, church and the government need to be separated. So they cannot support Christian prayers or Jewish prayers or Muslim prayers, or any of that. So during school, leadership cannot pray or lead students in prayers. And also, it's pretty strict. We've actually seen issues in schools even recently where you can't even have religious organizations coming into the building and meeting with students during public hours, school hours. Now, we have organizations like Young Christians Athletes organizations, and they can meet on their own time, but those are also supposed to be student-led, not adults, so that like religions don't come in and influence students without their parents' knowledge, so forth and so on. So you can have young Christian athletes, and that almost most high schools have those groups, but they meet as a group on their own, independent, and they don't lead prayers for other students to make people feel isolated. So Engel versus Vitale answers the question as of now that no, You cannot be forced to pray during school in a public environment. Private school, very different. Public school, which is paid by taxpayers, can't happen. And this gets in this idea of freedom of speech too. Freedom of speech is we're allowed to criticize the government and each other. Does this allow for all forms of art and press? And we're going to have that discussion in class more. But this is really the big boy in the room. This is what Voltaire really fights for. I don't think he envisioned freedom of speech as being like, oh, you could curse at people. That's not what freedom of speech was meant in the First Amendment. Freedom of speech was really this idea that we have to be free to speak our minds, to criticize the government and give each other feedback. And also the second part is the press, the media. So press has to have the freedom to criticize the government. Otherwise, you will set us up for a dictatorship or an oligarchy or a totalitarian state where the media, or in the Chinese, they might pretend to have these independent media organizations, but they still regulate and tell them what they can and can't publish in the press. And you got to think the press is so important. Many people argue it's the fourth branch of government because it checks the legislative, the executive, and judicial branches and tells us what's going on. And really good, strong journalism like National Public Radio, BBC News, they're trying to be objective and informative, and we can make our own decisions. Just like in this class, hopefully you guys can make your own decisions after you get the foundations and understand the power of these ideas. So very important that we have this power to criticize. That is what the initial intention of freedom of speech was probably for. It wasn't necessarily cursing or arguing, but however, and that gets into other questions, and we're going to learn actually, you can't get a ticket for cursing in public. That's not necessarily covered under freedom of speech. But here's the questions we're going to get into. What do you do with art? Pornography. What do we do with these concepts? Like, what is art? Who gets to regulate that? At what point is that freedom of speech an expression? Clothes. One of the big arguments and discussions by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is can we enforce a uniform policy in a public school? That is a big question. Well, the argument is, well, if the parents want it, and the principal wants it, and the teachers want it. But on the other side of it, there's the question of what about your freedom of expression, even as a teenager? Are you not allowed to freely express yourselves at this level? And those are very good questions. And ACLU is convinced that we're going to eliminate school uniforms. But there's a lot of people that still advocate for school uniforms. We have school uniforms. So let's look at this religious aspect of it. So we talk about freedom of religion. Like how diverse are we in America in terms of representation? So this is really interesting. I want you to look at this graph, or in these numbers. This charts and these numbers. And this is the number of congressmen and women based on their religion. And I want you to explain what trends or patterns you see on the number of people that are in Congress and their religious affiliations. Also, I'm going to challenge you to think, how does that really affect the way that they might legislate morality, what they think is right or wrong? What religions and what mindset might they be coming from? And also, this is really good of showing you kind of the percentage of people in Congress and where we're at. And I want you to think about and challenge you as a nation. Like, what percentage of Americans, for example, are really Christian? What percent are Catholic? What percent are Jewish? Is this a fair representation? Is it equitable? Does it give Jewish people enough representation? Or do they have more than enough representation? Does it give Buddhists and Muslims enough representation? Or do they not have enough representation? So I want you to answer the question. Okay, so we talk about freedom of speech. This is where we're really going to shock you. This is where I'm going to push you. Everybody says freedom of speech, and we can agree freedom of speech is not really about cursing or yelling at people in public. That's not really the point. But do we have freedom of speech? We have freedom of speech to criticize the government, but are we willing to protect the freedom of speech of groups that are like white supremacist groups? So are they entitled to the freedom of speech? When is it going too far? So we've said that inciting a riot is against the law. President Trump is essentially being charged with this idea of inciting a riot, like getting people to be violent or attacking the Capitol. That's not covered under freedom of speech. Um, Michael Brown's father was arrested years ago for saying, burn this town down, burn this S down. And he was charged with inciting a riot because they had a lot of people that are emotionally uncharged in public. They could start fires and they could destroy property. On the other side of it, though, are you going to let neo-Nazis like this Frank Collins fellow march down the neighborhood, what's called Skokie? So Skokie, Illinois is a very interesting neighborhood. Skokie, Illinois was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in 1979. And the American National Socialist Party, or the Nazis, they wanted to march and hold a political rally in a public park in Skokie, Illinois, which is predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And they were refused a permit. So they applied through the legal process. And they said, under freedom of speech, we'd like to do this in a public park. We're not going to incite riots or violence. It was rejected. It was rejected, and they weren't issued the license. So, like in St. Louis, if you wanted to get a license to speak at Forest Park, you'd have to apply, and it could be rejected. The organization's argument was, and there were other organizations that stepped in and said, this is not right. Under freedom of speech, even if it is hate speech, as long as it's not specifically inciting violence or telling people to hurt other people, if it's done through the permit process, it should be allowed. So they challenged this, and it went on for years. And in conclusion, they did win. The Supreme Court upheld the neo-Nazis' right to actually protest. It said that you do have a right, even if you are a hate group, to speak publicly if you follow the process of the law, as long as you're not inciting violence or a riot. And it did happen. And you saw the picture of it. So here's my question to you. So Voltaire, we say, is kind of the champion of freedom of speech. This is probably one of his most famous quotes. We believe he said it. We're not 100% certain, but he's always given credit with this. He says, I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. What do you think that means? And do you think that's true? Do you agree with Voltaire? I want you to take a minute and answer this. All right, so now we're going to get to the other parts of the First Amendment. We have peaceably assemble, and peaceably is correct. It's the correct term. We say peacefully assemble today, but it means we have a right to meet and protest or criticize the government, companies, or people in public, peaceably or peacefully today, right? So once you step on private property, you're in trouble. So if you were like to walk onto St. Louis University's property and you're protesting, that's against the law. That's trespassing, and they can charge you with that. However, if you're on the public sidewalk or you're in public areas, Forest Park, for example, that could be covered. That should be covered. And this is very important, these protests, as long as it's public. And then it gets into other areas of question, like we had obstruction of traffic. So during the Michael Brown cases, we had people closing down the highways in St. Louis. That was against the law. Police could arrest them and make them disperse because, first of all, it's dangerous. Cars could get smashing into each other, but they're obstructing the flow of traffic. But it's also a form of civil disobedience to get attention. So peaceably, again, can't incite riots or violence, but there are some questions. What does peaceably assembling mean? Now, the next part is we can write or email our politicians to either agree, disagree, or formally request a change in a law or the creation of a law through a petition. So you can see these guys are holding written petitions. Most petitions are done, through email and electronics today. That's why if you get on social media, it's kind of been very powerful at getting people to organize very quickly. And they can petition the government. They can petition their governors. You should always write your senator, your congressman or woman. So you have Cori Bush in the 1st District, and your senators are for Missouri, or Josh Hawley. And I want you could write them and explain to them anything all your feelings. You could always write to them and petition. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to change anything, but it can. If you have tens of thousands of people petitioning, politicians do pay attention to that. If something's unpopular amongst their constituents, it might change their mind. All right, we're going to go through real quick through a couple cases on the First Amendment. We're not going to do them all. You got Reynolds versus the United States. Very important case. It outlaws polygamy. So at the time, and there's still Mormons today, are a member of the United Church of Latter-day Saints. A Mormon man was married to several wives. He argued that under the First Amendment Establishment Clause and free exercise clause, that he had a right in his religion to marry whoever he wanted, as many women as he wanted. He lost. The Supreme Court said, no, we can set some expectations for legal reasons, like marriage, which is a legal contract where it's against the law to marry more than one person in America. So we have had people that come from other nations where they can have multiple wives, some religions, tribal cultures. And in America, the answer is no, you cannot have more than one wife. And you can't be arrested and imprisoned for that in America. Then you have Engel versus Vitale. We talked about that. School prayer is not allowed. It's against the law. Cannot be done, especially by principals or teachers or any adults coming into the school. However, just to be clear, I'm not saying that you as a student can't pray or you can't spend time on your own to pray. And you can't pray during the school day. As long as it doesn't interfere with class time, you're more than free to pray. So that's not what we're saying. Students are free to pray, but teachers and administrators and adults are not allowed to lead you in prayer. Lemon versus Kurtzman is not as important, but it's an interesting case. It basically says that the Supreme Court did agree that we can finance and use some religious institutions for non-religious reasons. So, for example, we could rent a building and pay them a church so that we could have voting there. That's not against the Establishment Clause, as long as it's for non-religious reasons, and we're just using it so that we do have to reimburse and pay religious organizations for that, and that is not a violation of the Establishment Clause. Santa Fe Independent Schools versus Doe. This is interesting. It's basically an extension of Engel versus Vitale. They start praying at football games in Santa Fe, and they would do it on the PA system on the field, and the players would kneel and pray, and the fans. But there were people in the fans that were not Christian and felt very uncomfortable. This went all the way up to Supreme Court in 2000. Supreme Court agreed, just like Engel versus Vitale. Even during school-sponsored events, we cannot lead you in prayer. So it's not just limited to the school day. A coach can't lead team members in prayer, and they cannot announce it or do it over a PA system at a football game or basketball game. At a public school, this only applies to public schools. Private schools can do what they want in terms of prayer. Their parents should know, and they signed up for it, and that's part of it, is we don't have coaches or adults leading people religiously during public school. So we don't like a Christian coach pushing his views on the basketball team and making them pray and making Muslim or Jewish or non-religious students uncomfortable. That's against the First Amendment rights under Santa Fe Independent Schools District versus Doe. Oregon versus Smith is an interesting one. This is more like a Reynolds versus United States. So this freedom of expression in your religion stuff, there are limits. And Oregon versus Smith is a really good example of this. Basically, there was two indigenous American men in Oregon, and in some institutions in some indigenous religions, they use a drug that's called peyote. It's a cactus hallucinogen, and it's popular. So people that do drugs do it. And what it does is basically it makes you sick and you hallucinate. It's kind of like mushrooms. It's poisoning your body. Like mushrooms poison you and they make you hallucinate. You're eating poison. However, they eat it for religious reasons, and they'll go with a shaman, which is a religious leader, and they'll go into out in the desert or into a spiritual area, and they believe that they're having a religious experience and a spiritual experience with nature and the spirits of the earth. And the argument was, we could do drugs if we're of indigenous American, and we can't get consequences for this. And the answer under Supreme Court in 1990 was no, that's not true. So if your religion is, for example, Rastafarian, and you could smoke marijuana, and marijuana is illegal, you can't smoke marijuana just because you're Rastafarian and not get arrested or get charges against it. And if you're indigenous American and you're Navajo, for example, and you want to do trip peyote with a shaman, that's not legal, and you can't be arrested for that and charged for having peyote. However, if it's on a Cherokee Nation or it's a nation like Navajo Nation, they can do things separate, if that makes sense, for religious reasons. So they can, in fact, do peyote on a reservation. They have much more religious freedom. But if you're Cherokee and you want to trip peyote at your house and you're not on the reservation, then it's against the law, and police could arrest you, for that.